The 2019 to 2028 Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Israel commits $38 billion in federal outlays over 10 years. Standard assessments of the relationship treat this financial package as pure foreign aid, a unilateral capital outflow leaving the Treasury. A forensic accounting of the agreement suggests it functions as a highly structured, self-liquidating defense industrial subsidy that predominantly cycles capital right back into the United States economy. The capital is strictly bifurcated. It provides a baseline of $3.3 billion in annual foreign military financing, or FMF grants, supplemented by a dedicated $500 million annual appropriation for cooperative missile defense. Unlike standard distributions that are dispersed quarterly, this structure requires the transfer of the entire annual allocation in a single lump sum within 30 days of budget enactment, where it is held in an interest-bearing U.S. bank account. A mechanism called cash flow financing further optimizes this capital, permitting the Israeli Ministry of Defense to leverage unappropriated future-year FMF commitments as collateral to execute immediate procurements of advanced platforms. Tracing the actual impact of this $38 billion requires following the capital through its specific legal and industrial cycle. Historically, the most distinctive feature of the FMF framework was a provision known as Offshore Procurement, or OSP. OSP allowed Israel to convert 26.3% of its dollar-denominated FMF grants into its local currency to spend on its own domestic industry. This effectively diverted $815.3 million away from U.S. defense contractors every year, functioning as a direct taxpayer subsidy for Israeli manufacturing. The 2016 renegotiation of the MOU initiated a restructuring of this flow, driven by the imperative to onshore manufacturing and revitalize the domestic supply chain. The current agreement enforces a rigid phase-out of the OSP allowance, dropping to zero by 2028. This backloaded glide path contracts severely from 2025. Over the 10-year MOU, cumulative OSP is capped at $5.55 billion, meaning $27.45 billion is retained entirely within the U.S. Enforcing this schedule redirects an additional $2.6 billion directly back into the U.S. manufacturing sector compared to the historical baseline. This captive capital flows directly to Tier 1 aerospace and defense contractors via direct commercial sales and foreign military sales. Lockheed Martin in Fort Worth, Texas, serves as a primary beneficiary, securing continuous production volume for 75 F-35A stealth fighters via the cash flow financing mechanism. Boeing captures a $5.2 billion STAR for F-15IA advanced fighter jets, sustaining production lines in St. Louis, Missouri. The OSP phase-out legally transforms a sovereign aid package into a predictable, multi-year industrial capacity subsidy for specific geographic nodes in the United States. To secure these multi-billion-dollar sovereign contracts, U.S. prime contractors agree to source subsystems from the recipient's domestic industrial base, a process known as reciprocal procurement. The procurement of the F-35I fleet represents a gross revenue stream for Lockheed Martin approaching $7.2 billion. Lockheed directed $1.75 billion in offset procurements, including the Generation 3 helmet. Because this helmet is mandatory for every F-35, this joint venture generates ongoing global revenue. Similarly, Israel Aerospace Industries captured $311 million to supply stealth-compliant outer wing skins. These agreements allow U.S. primes to integrate advanced subsystems and maintain secondary, technologically advanced suppliers without bearing the initial developmental costs. The $500 million annual appropriation for cooperative missile defense operates on a similar logic, functioning as bilateral venture capital. The David Sling system, jointly developed by Rafael and RTX, was designed to intercept medium to long-range rockets and cruise missiles. The primary asset here is cost asymmetry. The Stunner interceptor costs $1 million per unit, while the U.S. Patriot PAC-3 costs up to $7 million. RTX gained rights to integrate this lower-cost interceptor into the Patriot architecture, creating massive lifecycle savings. The Arrow-3 exo-atmospheric anti-ballistic missile system, co-developed by Boeing and IAI, represents the culmination of this co-development model. The system's performance triggered a historic export agreement with Germany via the European Sky Shield Initiative, with a total deal value reaching $6.7 billion. Because Boeing maintains a 40 to 50% production work share, this single European export transaction generates up to $3.35 billion in direct manufacturing revenue, utilizing allied acquisitions to scale the U.S. supply chain. Beyond hardware and production shares, the MOU provides a specialized, indirect return through Israel's role as a live combat testing environment for U.S. platforms. Israel is the sole international operator authorized to modify the core architecture of the F-35 with its own indigenous electronic warfare modules and data links. The financial burden of these modifications, including $11.4 million for software data loads and $34 million for stealth-compliant external fuel tanks, is borne entirely by Israel. Continuous deployment in highly contested airspace generates vast amounts of sensor fusion telemetry and threat library signatures captured during real-world operations. This feed of operational intelligence is shared directly with the U.S. Joint Program Office and Lockheed Martin. Thermal degradation and telemetry data from combat deployments of the Iron Beam system is currently accelerating equivalent programs for the U.S. Army. By leveraging Israeli-funded software integration and combat data, the U.S. Department of Defense replaces years of expensive simulated evaluations with real-world results, reducing the R&D attrition that typically plagues fifth-generation fleet modernization. To evaluate the scale of the MOU, the $3.8 billion annual outlay must be measured against the alternative cost of achieving equivalent regional objectives. The U.S. National Defense Strategy mandates securing global maritime choke points and containing regional actors to ensure the flow of global commercial trade. The foundational unit for achieving this deterrence is the Carrier Strike Group. Procuring a single Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier requires $13.3 billion in capital outlays, with escorting destroyers reaching up to $2.7 billion each. Comparing ledgers reveals how the MOU interacts with sovereign naval deployment liabilities. Annual deployed carrier operations average $1.18 billion. The air wing adds $910 million, and a standard escort adds $1.5 billion, totaling $3.6 billion in base costs. Tactical aviation and interceptor attrition against asymmetric threats further inflate this balance sheet. Given the U.S. Navy requires an overall shipbuilding budget expansion to meet global force architecture goals, permanent Middle Eastern deployments present a significant constraint on Indo-Pacific readiness. By allocating a predictable $3.8 billion grant, the United States transfers the financial attrition of regional containment away from the DoD and onto a localized proxy force. The FMF package operates as a highly subsidized insurance premium. It is functionally cheaper than maintaining an additional forward-deployed carrier strike group, while recycling the vast majority of the funds directly back into the U.S. domestic economy.